Hello, it's Dawn Michelle and welcome back to my channel. As we're coming up on the end of another year, I always find myself sort of sitting in reflection during this season. Something about the fall, which honestly right now feels more like winter at the moment, but something about the fall encourages me to review my decks, my collection, to go back through my old journals and to see how my practice has evolved. One of the things that I've noticed over the last few years of sort of sitting in this mirror time is that while the decks may change and my focuses may shift, there are certain aspects to my practice that remain ever present. So this got me thinking about how these practices were actually my support system. They're the decks, the workings, the rituals that keep me going year after year. And it brought to mind that phrase, "it takes a village," because that's how my decks feel to me. They're like my little village of contributors to my personal growth journey, my sort of personal council of advisors, if you will. So I thought it would be fun to take a look at those key elements, the energies, and the workings that remain constant in my practice and share the decks that are currently playing the part or have been playing the part for some time as my village advisors. So I've created 9 prompts or roles in my village based on the practices that I most often engage with. I would love to know what decks are taking up residence in your village at the moment, so please feel free to do a VR or share with me in the comments below. While you're welcome to use the same categories that I have, I encourage you to also create your own based on your own unique practice. So let's go ahead and take a look at the decks that have been supporting me on my journey throughout this year. So the first prompt or category or role in my village is the guide. And this is like my personal deck. This is the deck that I tend to go to for just anytime I need any sort of personal advice or reflection. Now this deck changes with me seasonally, or in this case, 2 decks, because here I have 2 decks, and clearly you'll see throughout this tag, I have not stuck to 1 deck per prompt, but you certainly can if you'd like to. So my personal guide decks, right, there are some, and there's one in particular that you have seen a million times on my channel, and that's the Llewellyn Tarot, right? I always have the Llewellyn Tarot at hand. It sits on a box just on my table here, and that's kind of like my always personal guide deck. I do gravitate toward personal guide decks that resonate with the current season. So we are in fall, technically, here in the Pacific Northwest. And over the last month or so, I've been drawn to work with my Green Witch Tarot. This is a long time favorite in my collection. I've had this deck for many, many years. I love how it's witchy and pagan, and even though I don't really identify as a witch, there are a lot of magical aspects to my personal practice. And I feel like this kind of takes that energy and brings it down really beautifully into the sort of mundane world, right? It feels very everyday to me, but very everyday in that very earthy, magical way. And I feel like it works really well in terms of just kind of guiding me on my journey and giving me that advice, the direction, the support. It's kind of one of those all-around readers for me, right? It's a deck that I can turn to for absolutely any kind of reading. It resonates really well with my personal practice. It resonates really well with the way I see the world, the way I interact with community and family and myself and my roots, my practice, my mundane life, and even into my spiritual life. It's kind of all of those things rolled into one for me. And so it's often a deck that I use whenever I just need some general assistance, or I really don't have a particular deck or practice that relates to whatever the question is that I'm thinking about or something that I'm working through. And so I'll grab a deck that is my personal guide deck. So now another deck that is fairly new to my collection in the last later half of this year is the Tree Whisper Oracle. And I know, I'm sorry, I've shown this deck many, many times lately, but it is a deck that is kind of sitting very firmly in my little village of advisors as a personal journey deck. It's a deck that I pull from a lot when I'm needing some clarity, when I'm wanting some advice. It does have a bit of a ancestor sage elder, which is another prompt, tree spirit kind of an energy. But because it doesn't sit firmly in one particular space or another, meaning that I use this deck for all kinds of readings, but it's always a deck that kind of points me in the right direction. It gives me the message that I need. It gives me the keyword that I most need to tie into at the moment. And it really helps me to kind of create a path through whatever it is that I'm trying to work through at the moment, or think about, or work on, or deal with, as the case may be. So I think this deck works really, really well for that for me. I love the images. I love the energy of it. I've mentioned it before, like Mags's decks just kind of radiate with this gorgeous intention and energy that I feel really comes through in the deck itself. And it's an energy that I find is really, really beneficial to me and my personal practice. So again, the two decks that are acting as my personal guides currently are the Green Witch Tarot, which is a mass market deck, and the Tree Whisper Oracle, which is an indie deck. I apologize, it is currently out of print. So the next prompt or role in my village is that of the Caregiver. And this is the deck, or the decks, that I often turn to when I need support. And a lot of times this is when I need sort of emotional support. So they're kind of that caregiver, nurturer, almost hug style of decks for me. Now, these are not two decks that I work with together, like at all, but they are definitely decks that I turn to when I need a supporting message. So the one that I've been using the most throughout this year is the Gentle Tarot. Now, I have several different versions of this deck, but this one is actually my favorite. This is the Linen edition. I also have a couple of the Pocket editions. This deck I've mentioned many, many times. I've worked with it a lot over the last couple of years, and it is still kind of remaining in that space of the caregiver for me, as it has since this deck came into my collection, I think last year, or maybe the year before. I can't remember when the first edition came out, but I've been working with it since the first edition came out, and it's sat very solidly in that role of caregiver for me. I absolutely love the messages. Now there is a big, beautiful guidebook which goes even deeper, even further into the messages and medicine of this deck, and I do get into the guidebook whenever I have the opportunity when I work with these cards, because there's so much wonderful supportive energy in the guidebook. However, it is a deck that I don't need to. So if I am in a hurry and I need that supportive message right this 5 minutes, or maybe I'm tired and I don't want to go through the whole, getting into the guidebook and doing all the journaling and all that. I just want to shuffle, pull cards, and get that supportive message. This is the deck that I turn to. It also lives in my favorites basket, which is another video that I did not too long ago. But again, this deck, the Gentle Tarot, sits very firmly in the role of caregiver, and has for a year or two now. It really hasn't left that spot for me, and it's definitely a deck that I turn to whenever I need that supportive energy. It's not the only thing that it does for me, but it's definitely the way that I use it most often, is when I need that hug deck, that supportive energy, that kind of everything's gonna be okay, but here's what you need to know about the situation, because it doesn't shy away from the hard things. So the newer caregiver deck in my collection that I've been working with the last couple months pretty intensively is the Guardian Angel Messages, and this is the newer version of an old deck. I do believe. I think they're pretty close. Somebody did mention that the guidebooks are exactly the same. The cards, however, look completely different. I do have a video on this deck and the other deck by Radley Valentine that I have as well. This deck, I absolutely love the artwork. I feel like, no offense to previous artists who have done Radley Valentine's decks, but I kind of feel like this artist finally kind of captured the energy of his decks, and I really, really enjoy it. But I find that just for when I just need a message in the moment, this is the deck that I've actually been pulling, and I almost pulled out the other deck to go with it. Again, I did a whole video on those two decks together. It's the Angel Wisdom, I think is the name of it, because I do use them together quite often. But when I'm kind of just wanting a message in the moment, this is the deck that I've been pulling for that comfort and that support these days. I've been using this one quite frequently for that. And I do actually get into the guidebook. I can't remember if I mentioned the guidebook in the original video, but over the last month or so, I've been getting into the guidebook quite a bit and have been reading the messages, because part of my connection to this deck or these types of decks is very specifically Radley Valentine's approach and the messages that he writes in the guidebooks. So I have been diving into that more. So those are the two decks that are kind of sitting in that caregiver spot for me. The Gentle Tarot, which has sat solidly in that spot for well over a year. And then in this later half of the year, the Guardian Angel Messages Tarot is also been occupying that space as well. So the next role or position in my village is that of the Muse. Now this is very specific to my personal practice because I do a lot of creative work. You know, I've been working on decks, I write books, I create content, and so a lot of what I do in any given day is very creatively focused, very creatively minded. And so I tend to need a lot of guidance and support in that particular area of my life. And the two decks that have really kind of sat solidly in that space since the time they came into my collection. So I think probably over a year for the Lioness. I think I'd have to check. And then definitely for this year for the Vision of the Muse. So these are two decks that have been really important in my creative work. Whenever I start feeling creatively blocked, these are the decks that I tend to go to. I absolutely love the Lioness Oracle Tarot. It's a collage deck. It has some really great energy to it. There's a lot of Leo energy in this deck. I feel like there's a lot of lions and big cats. And to me, that ties into that creative work. It also ties into my moon and rising sign, both of which are Leo. For me, this is my Leo deck. This is my creative energy deck. I use this a lot when I need direction on my creative work, as well as when I'm experiencing creative blocks, which is something that happens quite often for me, to be perfectly honest. I also struggle with issues around imposter syndrome when it comes to my creative work, right? I struggle with perfectionism. And I think that's one of the things that this deck in particular really helps me with, because it's hand-cut collage. It is not perfect. And it kind of gives me permission to not be perfect as well. And I really appreciate that about this deck, because I really struggle with that, in particular with my creative work. And then we have the Vision of the Muse, which is the Oracle deck by the same creator. And I often talk about how I don't particularly like pairing decks from the same creator together. I always think it's going to be a good idea, and then a lot of times it doesn't really work for me. But these two decks, however, work together really well. I love the keywords on the Vision of the Muse. I really use that as a focal point in a lot of my creative work readings. And then I let the Lioness Oracle Tarot create that fuller message around it, right? The Oracle deck provides the focal point and the Tarot provides the additional message beyond. So these are the two decks that have really sat very firmly in that role of the Muse in my village, and that is the Lioness Oracle Tarot and the Vision of the Muse Oracle. So the next role in my village is that of the counselor. So these are the decks that I tend to go to when I need assistance or advice, most often dealing with relationships and particularly with family issues. So that's kind of where that counseling advisor energy kind of comes in for me. And the two decks that I have here are the Anna Kay and the Morgan Greer. Now, the Anna Kay has sat super firmly as my family counselor for years. This is the regular mass market edition. All I've done is edge it, but I do have a second copy of this deck that I've trimmed down to be the exact same size as my Llewellyn Tarot, because I work with those two decks together, the Llewellyn representing me and the Anna Kay representing my immediate family. So this is the deck that I use for readings about my immediate family. So I don't really do readings about other people, but I use this deck to help me understand situations and where I can maybe assist, or what I can do, or what I need to know about what's going on in a situation. This deck has been that for me for years. I do use it for other things, because one of the things that I really love about this deck is that it strips away all the esoterica for the most part, out of the tarot. And it really just focuses on kind of the everyday, mundane, sort of bare bones understanding of the system of tarot. And I mean that in like the best possible way. And it's also not afraid to call you out on things. The characters in this deck are part of what does it for me. It's the beautiful imperfectness of the figures in this deck, the expressiveness of their faces. They are so alive for me with energy and expression and feeling and emotion. And again, when we're looking at family issues, particularly like my immediate family, right? My husband and my children, that is what I use this deck for most often. And I feel like it gets right to the heart of whatever it is that's going on that I need to understand. Like I said, the beautifully imperfect figures, which represent my real life. There's nobody in the world that is perfect, right? None of us are perfect. And I love that this deck really kind of just leans into that in such a gorgeous way. It's not modern, it's very medieval in a sense, but for whatever reason, of all the decks that I own, this one I feel like most closely embodies the energy of my family. It's very mundane, right? It's very much in the everyday world. It's very much in the nitty-gritty, but it's alive with imperfection. It's alive with feeling and emotion and connection and everydayness. Now, when it comes to work with my extended family, and even sometimes, other relationships in my life, I often have turned to the Morgan Greer. And this has been a deck that I've used quite a bit in the this last year or so for this. It really resonates with a lot of paternal energy for me. And so it's often a deck that I will pull from when I'm seeking that energy specifically as well, when I'm seeking that kind of advice. So it's very much a counselor deck in that way, in the type of energy that it has, in the way that it presents the messages to me. It's very, very plain spoken. It has a lot of paternal energy. It feels very much like it's loving and supportive, but it's strong and stern where it needs to be. And I do really appreciate that about this deck. It, again, similar to the Anna Kay, even though there are layers of other symbols in here, other esoteric influences, I can completely ignore all that in this deck. And again, it gets very much down to the nitty-gritty heart of the, essence of the card itself. And I really appreciate that about this deck. This close-up view of it makes it feel very personal. And it does, for me, function very well as a relationship deck, just for, working with relationships, any relationship in my life. And I think part of that is because it's so up close and personal. It feels like an intimate conversation. So those are the two decks that are sitting in the role of counselor in my village, the Anna Kay, which has been my immediate family counselor for years, and the Morgan Greer Tarot, which has been my sort of relationship counselor, we shall say, for most of this year. So the next role in my village is that of the Priestess or the Mystic. So this is the sort of spiritual work deck. Now, this was actually a hard category for me personally because my spiritual work does tend to revolve around seasonal energies as well as things going on in my life. So I work a lot with personified deity, and when I'm working specifically with a personified deity such as the Black Madonna or Isis or Kali, I will pull decks that relate specifically to those energies for me. So there's lots of decks that fit in that realm for me. However, the deck for this year that has kind of served as more of a generic spiritual work deck is the Intuitive Night Goddess Tarot. Now, this deck for me functions very much in a general spiritual sense because it does not tie into any particular culture, religion, deity, practice, or tradition. It feels like a spiritual deck in a general sense, and I mean that, again, in the very best loving possible way. It feels connected to the above and the below. It feels grounded in the everyday, grounded in my real practice, but it connects to that larger let's say, cosmic energy or that larger spiritual energy. So when I need just spiritual guidance and or connection in that kind of generic or general sense, this is the deck that I most often turn to. Now, I will use this deck and pull in specific decks for like personified deity. If I'm working with, say, like the Black Madonna, perhaps I might pull in decks that relate to that, or Mother Mary, or angels, you know, any of those types of specific energies that I'm working with. I may pull those in and pair with the intuitive night goddess. But a lot of times, if I'm just seeking a little bit of broad-based spiritual guidance or connection to spirit in a very broad sense without tapping into certain traditions or certain energies, this is the deck that I most often go to. And that serves really well in that function for me as just a general kind of priestess deck. She stands at the helm of my inner temple and guides me in the general direction that I need to go. And then I can choose to work with individual energies for specific work from there. And I really enjoy that about this deck. It's kind of like my non-denominational spiritual deck. It really occupies that beautiful liminal space of spirit, but allows me to access it. So in that way, it kind of works as a conduit. Again, so it's like a mystic deck. It's a priestess deck. It provides that access for me to that space, to that energy that I want to work with. And it does so in a very kind of broad way so that I am kind of open to work with additional energies if I want to, or just sit with that particular kind of just connection to spirit in a general sense. So that is the deck that for most of this year has been occupying the space of my priestess or mystic, and that is the Intuitive Night Goddess Tarot. So the next spot in my village is that of the Elder, and deck that has served in that slot for me, or that role for me for quite a while now, a couple of years, is the Barbara Walker Tarot. This deck it's a little bit brutal in some cases, but it never fails to deliver like the advice and the message that I need to hear. Whether or not I want to hear it is a totally different story. This deck does not care if I want to hear it or not. It's going to tell me what I need to know. And so it sits in that space of kind of that a little bit salty, a little bit rough elder, that it has that grandmother energy of like, grandma's seen some things, and right, she's kind of tired and she's a little bit like fed up with your crap, and she just wants you to get the message and like move on with your life, right? That's the energy that I get out of this deck, which I absolutely love because I feel like I need that in my life. I need decks that will give me that butt kick, will tell me what I need to know even when it's not necessarily something that I want to hear. I have lots of other decks that, you know, are those soft and gentle and supportive decks. But sometimes what I need is the salty old grandma deck. And that's what this deck is for me. Like, it will forever be the salty old grandma. I cannot see it any other way now, because that is how it reads. That's the voice it speaks to me in. And I love it. And it never fails to provide the advice that I actually need to hear. So a newer deck that is really providing that elder kind of sage advice energy for me is the Mystic Palette Tarot. Now this deck I kind of have a little bit of a special connection to. I did a whole video on it because this deck for me was kind of like seeing my personal path come around full circle. But what I really love about this deck is a lot of the figures are older, and it does feel like I'm getting that sage elder advice. It's not salty or harsh like the Barbara Walker is. It has a little bit more of a softer, gentler way that it delivers the message. But it does tell me what I need to hear. It gives me the advice that I need in the moment when I need it, and it's a very clear reader, that understanding that comes from a life well lived. And to me, this deck feels like it's not even just like this life well lived. It feels like it's reaching back even further into past lives, into past generations, and that comes through collective wisdom. And that's really where this deck sits for me. It's kind of that elder of collective wisdom, whereas the Barbara Walker is that elder of the salty grandma. So those are the two decks that I have been using for the sage advice, my elder decks. Clearly, I do not use these decks together, but that is the Barbara Walker Tarot, which has been an elder deck for quite some time in my collection, and a newer deck, but has very much firmly earned its place there, is the Mystic Palette Tarot. So the next role in my village is that of the teacher, and this is a study deck. I almost always have a study deck going on, and it changes from year to year. Sometimes it changes from season to season. The deck that I have selected as my teacher, my study deck, is the OG Thoth. And I've pulled out this book to go along with it because I feel like this book needs honorable mention in this little category as the teacher deck, or as the teacher role. This is my trimmed version of the Thoth. So I have this deck in multiple versions. I have it in the smaller edition and the pocket, which I have left the borders on both of those. This is the deck that I use when I'm trying to really connect to the artwork and not get too wrapped up in the titles. It's also a deck that I used for study. Once I kind of got through my initial study with the Thoth, which I started actually in 2021 and then rolled over with a group of friends into 2022. And I used this deck quite a bit with that when I was actually learning. And then once I kind of felt like I had a good sort of handle on the cards, like I feel like I'm never going to stop learning the Thoth, but once I felt like I had a decent handle on the cards, I took it down borderless, and then that allows me to kind of also almost use it like flashcards. Can I recognize the card just by the artwork? And then can I think of the title of the card, and can I think of all of its associations and all of that? So in that way, this particular deck itself has very much served as a study deck, as a teacher, as a learning tool. But just the OG Thoth in and of itself has been a study deck for me for quite a while. I kind of flow in and out with how much I'm actually studying it versus how much I'm actually using it. I have specific readings that I do with the Thoth. I shared, I think, one with my members as well. And I really enjoy the system of it. I do not necessarily always resonate with Crowley, the creator, with his visions of the world and things in general, but I do really like Lady Frida Harris's artwork, and for me that's kind of what this deck is about. It's more about her artwork and the way that she's envisioned these cards, these energies. It's a very esoteric deck, so if I want to dive into that as well and want to spend some time playing with those correspondences, this is often the deck I will pull out for that. And I do want to mention this book, even though like it's not a deck, but I'm going to throw it in here anyway because it's my tag and I can. This book is the book that actually made me realize that I could use the Thoth Tarot for like everyday stuff. It's the book that kind of made the deck less intimidating. Gerd Sigler, I was pointing down here, his name's up here, Gerd Sigler, he takes the cards and he kind of breaks it down into, we have keywords, a little bit about the card, and then the thing that I really love, he does talk about things that we see on the deck or on the cards. It talks about some of the associations that are drawn into the deck itself, but then we also have indications, questions, suggestions, and affirmations. And adding this layer has really helped me to see how this particular deck can be used for more than just these really high vibration, high energy sort of readings, which is where I think I've mentioned, it might have been with members, but I've mentioned before, like the RWS feels mundane and this feels spiritual. And that's just the way that I kind of see those two systems. But this book really helped me to see that this deck really does have the potential for more than that. And so it was a wonderful teacher, and it still is a wonderful teacher. Anytime I read with the Thoth, this is the book that I go to because it speaks to me in a language that like I understand, where some of the other books, they go a little above my head, I'll just be honest. So I wanted to throw it in there as an honorable mention. So that's the deck and book that really sit in the teacher role for me in that study deck space in my village. The next role in my village is the outsider. And this is the deck that just doesn't quite belong, but somehow fits really, really well. And I thought this would just be a fun category because I do have a couple of decks that I'm like, why do I even have you? I love you, but why do I even have you? And for me, a deck that feels very much like an outsider in my collection is the Tarot of Curious Creatures. I have talked about this deck a lot. I've done a lot of videos on it. It's super fun. It's really weird. It is collage, which I really like, but like animal decks really aren't a thing in my collection. And when I first saw this deck come out, like I first saw pictures of it, I was like, oh no, that's not for me. What is going on in these cards? They're so weird. And then I saw Lisa do a walkthrough and then I was hooked. I had to try it. I had to get it. And I have to say that like, I absolutely love it. I don't know why it fits for me. It's the outsider in my collection. It shouldn't fit. I shouldn't like this deck. I have not had really the ability to connect with any other decks from this creator. I've rehomed them all. I've had them all indie, I've rehomed them. I've had them all mass market, I've rehomed them. But this deck for me, for whatever reason, just hits the mark. And in a way that is just so fun and different. And I think that's part of what I really like about this deck and why it's kind of that outsider in my collection, is that I feel like a lot of my collection is very tied into specific energies, specific roles, or even specific themes, right? Like I have a lot of earthy decks and I have a lot of cosmic decks and I have a lot of decks that really serve in those other categories that I've talked about throughout this tag, like the support decks, the creative decks, the spiritual decks, the elder decks, right? I have a lot of those types of decks. This deck is none of those things. It's not a guide, it's not a caregiver, it's not a muse, it's not a counselor, right? It's none of those things. It is strictly a for fun deck. For it, it's an energy that I feel like I don't have in any other deck. It's totally unique. It's totally weird. And it's on my shelf of favorite things. And I think I mentioned it in my favorite baskets video because it's favorite basket adjacent because it just doesn't fit, but it sits right next to it because I keep it at hand. And like, it's the total outsider deck in my collection, but it belongs, it fits. I really can't imagine ever rehoming this deck because it makes me laugh every time I look at it, and I absolutely love it for that. So that's my outsider, the deck that just really doesn't belong, but has earned itself a place in my village nonetheless, the Tarot of Curious Creatures. And finally, the last category or last role in my village is that of the Stranger. So this is the deck that's new in my collection, but I feel like is going to earn itself a place in my village. And this is the Energy Archaeology Oracle deck. It's very new. I haven't had a chance to work with it yet, but I have plans of working with it very specifically for healing work. And in particular, like physical and energetic healing work, that's kind of my goal. And I do feel like, because I've watched many videos of people using this deck in similar ways, and I've started reading through the guidebook and things like that, I definitely feel like this deck is going to sit in that space for me. So I feel like it's new to the village, right? It's the Stranger, it's new to town, but I think it's gonna be a really productive and important member of my little village community. And so I'm gonna give it a mention here because I think it's a really interesting deck. It does something totally different than any other decks that I have. I don't have any decks that feel so connected to the body in this way. And as a person who struggles with a lot of health issues, and I have a lot of chronic health issues, body work is something that I definitely need to be focusing on. So that's the last deck in my village, the Energy Archaeology Oracle, which is the Stranger who's new to town. So that's the 9 roles that I created for my tarot village. I would love to know what decks would be in your village, so please feel free to do a VR or just share with me in the comments below. You're welcome to use the same categories that I have. I'll leave them in the description box for you, but I also encourage you to create your own, put together your own little card village and see what decks have been there to create your support system over the last year or the last season, however long you would like to take a look at it. I have given this video a handy little hashtag, and I have put the year on it because I feel like this is an exercise that I could do every year, and it would be really interesting to see what decks remain in my deck village and what decks move out for other things. As always, you'll find links for everything that I've showed here in the description box below. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and I look forward to sharing with you again soon.